What if I told you that the most powerful weapon of World War II was not made of steel, but of paper? In the hell of trenches and bombings, when it seemed that humanity had evaporated along with the smoke from the explosions, a thin sheet of paper became a lifeline. It was not just correspondence, it was psychological armor that protected the mind from madness. Soldiers wrote home, describing not the horrors of battle, but simple trench joys. Hot tea, a comrade's funny joke, a found pack of cigarettes. And in response, they received news from a world where gardens still bloomed and children still laughed. This connection was oxygen for the soul, allowing them to remember what they were fighting for. Watch the video to the end to find out how a single letter received in the trenches of Stalingrad changed the course of a local battle, and why censors sometimes deliberately allowed forbidden information to pass. Are you ready to learn the truth about what really saved soldiers from madness? In conditions where reality turned into a continuous nightmare, letters became the only window into normal life. The process of writing and receiving letters created a routine that structured the chaos and gave a sense of control over one's own life. For a soldier on the front lines, it was vital to feel like more than just a cog in the war machine, but a person, a son, a husband, a friend. Letters were tangible proof of these connections. Every line from home was a reminder that he was loved, remembered, and awaited. It was a form of meditation. By putting letters on paper, soldiers could temporarily distract themselves from the roar of artillery and fear. Their thoughts transported them to their homes, where they recalled peaceful days and made plans for the future, which in itself was an act of incredible psychological fortitude. Interestingly, soldiers often avoided describing the horrors of war in their letters. They wrote about everyday trifles, joked, and supported their loved ones. It was a conscious strategy of self-preservation, not to let the war into the small world they created on paper. Receiving a letter was a big event, a celebration. It was read and reread dozens of times, carried in a breast pocket like a talisman. The scent of perfume on the envelope or a child's drawing on the back were a powerful incentive to keep living. Psychologists of the time, although they did not use modern terms, intuitively understood the importance of this connection. The command encouraged correspondence in every way, understanding that a soldier who received news from home would fight with redoubled strength. The field mail service worked with incredible efficiency despite all the difficulties. The ritual itself, waiting for the postman, sorting through letters, reading good news aloud, was part of trench life. It created a sense of stability and predictability in a world where death could come at any moment. We would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about how modern technologies such as instant messaging would change this magic of letters on the front lines? Write about it in the comments. Want to know the secret that changed wartime postal logistics? When the U.S. entered World War II, a huge problem arose: how to deliver millions of letters to soldiers scattered around the world, from Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Regular mail took up too much space on transport ships and planes, which were needed to transport weapons and food. The solution was ingenious and technological: the V-mail system, or Victory Mail. Letters were written on a special standard form, which was then photographed onto 16mm microfilm. An entire bag containing 150,000 letters could fit onto a single reel of film the size of a pack of cigarettes. These reels were transported by plane across the ocean. At their destination, the film was developed, and each letter was printed as a small photo card measuring approximately 10 by 13 centimeters. These photo letters were then delivered to their recipients. This technology reduced the weight and volume of mail by 98%. What used to take up 37 mail bags and weigh more than a ton now fit into one small bag. This freed up a huge amount of space on transport for critical cargo. Delivery speeds also increased significantly. A letter from the U.S. to England could arrive in 10 to 12 days, while regular mail took several weeks to arrive by sea. For a soldier waiting for news from home, this difference was enormous. The V-mail system was a joint project of the War Department, the U.S. Postal Service, and Kodak, which provided microfilming technology. Special stations were set up in major cities around the world to process the letters. Soldiers and their families quickly got used to the new format. Although the small photo letters could not convey the tactile sensations of a regular letter, their speed and reliability outweighed any disadvantages. It was a price everyone was willing to pay for fast communication. Censorship also became easier and more effective. It was easier for censors to review standard forms before photographing them than to sort through a variety of letter and postcard formats. This sped up the processing and delivery of correspondence. The V-mail system was a real revolution in military logistics. It showed how technological innovations can solve not only combat, but also humanitarian tasks. During the war, more than 1 billion V-mail letters were processed. This technology was not just a technical solution, it became a symbol of national unity. Each V-mail form was a reminder that the entire country, from Kodak engineers to ordinary housewives, was working toward a common victory. But what if I told you that sometimes the content of the letter was not as important as what was hidden between the lines? Are you ready to learn about the secret ciphers and codes used by soldiers and their families? What I am about to show you was strictly forbidden by military censorship. Military censorship was the all-seeing eye that reviewed every letter sent from or to the front. Its task was to prevent the leakage of information about the location of units, plans of operations, or casualties. But human ingenuity always found a way to circumvent the prohibitions. Lovers came up with their own codes that only they could understand. For example, the placement of a stamp on an envelope, a specific mark, or a deliberately made spelling mistake could carry a secret meaning that was completely invisible to the censor. Sometimes quotes from books or songs were used as codes. By agreeing in advance on a key work, it was possible to convey entire messages simply by indicating the page and line number. To an outsider, it looked like a normal cultural reference. Photographs also became carriers of secret information. An inconspicuous detail in the background, a certain pose, or an object in the hands could convey much more than was allowed to be written in the text. Of course, such photographs were carefully checked, but it was impossible to catch all the nuances. Censors, in turn, were constantly improving their skills. They underwent special training, studying psychology and possible tricks. There were entire catalogs of suspicious phrases and techniques. Sometimes it turned into a real intellectual duel. Soldiers came up with new ways to hide information, and censors tried to figure them out. At stake in this game was not only military secrecy, but also the personal freedom of the letter's author. This phenomenon shows how strong people's need for informal, lively communication was. Even under threat of punishment, they took risks to convey to each other what could not be entrusted to official correspondence. It was a struggle for the right to personal feelings and secrets. What you are about to learn will change your perception of how the Postal Service works. The work of the Field Mail Service was akin to a feat of heroism. Postmen, often unarmed or with minimal weapons, had to deliver letters and parcels to the most advanced positions under heavy enemy fire. They were awaited in every dugout, and their appearance was tantamount to the arrival of a guardian angel. The sorting and delivery system was fine-tuned down to the smallest detail. Each military unit had its own unique field mail number, which replaced a long and secret address. This made it possible, on the one hand, to preserve military secrecy, and, on the other, to ensure accurate and fast delivery. Mail was transported by all available means of transport: trains, trucks, planes, and, in the final stage, on foot. The postman, with a heavy bag overflowing with letters, made his way through trenches and craters to deliver the cherished triangles to the soldiers. The loss of a mail car or truck as a result of bombing was a real tragedy. Soldiers were no less distressed by this than by the loss of an ammunition depot. After all, it was not just pieces of paper that were destroyed in the fire, but the hopes and voices of loved ones. For soldiers who were surrounded, field mail was the only link connecting them to the mainland. Letters were delivered by plane, dropped by parachute, along with food and ammunition. Receiving news from home in such a cauldron was a real miracle. Postmen were not just couriers, but psychologists. They knew almost all the soldiers in their area by sight, rejoiced with them when they received good news, and supported them when bad news arrived. Often, soldiers could confide in the postman things they would not tell their commander. In addition to letters, the field post delivered newspapers. The latest issue of the Frontline or Central newspaper was read until it was worn out. It was a window to the wider world, a source of information and propaganda that kept up morale. Parcels from home were a special joy. Simple but precious items. A tobacco pouch, knitted socks, a piece of homemade lard reminded soldiers of warmth and care. These parcels were often shared among the entire platoon, strengthening the brotherhood at the front. The field mail service never stopped for a single day. It was as important a part of the war machine as the supply of ammunition or the work of hospitals. The command understood that the morale of the Army depended directly on how regularly soldiers received letters. What do you think was the most underappreciated profession during the war? What if I told you that sometimes silence was louder than any cry? For people under occupation, communication with relatives fighting in the Red Army was virtually impossible. Any attempt to send a letter across the front line was deadly dangerous and equated to espionage. But people found ways. Letters were often delivered by partisans. Couriers risked their lives to carry messages through forests and swamps. These letters were written on tiny scraps of paper in small, neat handwriting so that they could be easily hidden. Sometimes hiding places were used. A letter could be left in a tree hollow or under a certain stone on a path where a courier would pick it up. It was a difficult and dangerous game in which any mistake could cost a life. The content of these letters was filled with pain and hope. People wrote about the atrocities of the occupiers, about hunger, about their faith in victory, and that their loved ones would return and liberate them. Each such letter is an indictment of war. For a soldier, receiving such a letter was both a joy and a torment. On the one hand, there was the joy of knowing that his loved ones were alive. On the other hand, there was the terrible truth about what they were going through and the burning feeling of helplessness at not being able to help them immediately. These letters became a powerful source of motivation. After reading about the suffering of his family, a soldier would go into battle with redoubled fury, avenging his mother's tears and his children's fear. It was no longer just a war for the country, it was a personal war for his home. After the liberation of the territories, entire archives of such unsent letters were found. People wrote them to nowhere, simply to vent their pain and preserve the memory of events. They believed that someday these letters would be read. There was also feedback. Partisans brought back from the mainland not only reports from the Information Bureau, but also letters from soldiers to their relatives in the occupied villages. Knowing that their son or husband was alive and fighting was a huge support for people. This correspondence across the front line was a tiny stream of information in an ocean of Nazi propaganda lies. It kept people's spirits up, supporting their belief that they had not been forgotten and that liberation would come. The story of these letters is a story of silent heroism. The heroism of the couriers who risked their lives and the heroism of those who waited and believed while under the enemy's oppression. Ready to learn about the most terrifying piece of paper in war? Among the stream of letters carrying hope and love, there was one type of correspondence that was feared like fire. It was an official notification of the death of a soldier, popularly known as a funeral notice. The dry, official language of this document instantly destroyed the life of an entire family. Funeral notices were not delivered by ordinary postmen, but by representatives of the military registration and enlistment office. Their appearance on the doorstep could not be mistaken for anything else. A man in military uniform with a folder in his hands, and the heart of a mother or wife would break. The text of the notification was standard and emotionless. Your husband's son, faithful to his military oath, showing heroism and courage, was killed in battle. Behind these formal words lay a tragedy that was impossible to measure. Upon receiving such a notification, many did not believe it, hoping for a mistake. They continued to write letters to the front, to the same field post office number, in a desperate attempt to refute the terrible truth. Sometimes, unfortunately, mistakes did happen, and the fallen soldier returned home after the war. The funeral notice changed the status of the woman, making her a widow and the children orphans. It brought not only grief, but also many everyday problems related to receiving benefits and privileges. It was a document that officially registered the tragedy. The whole village or street empathized with the family's grief. It was a shared grief, because almost every house had someone fighting in the war, and every day the same envelope could arrive. There was no such thing as someone else's misfortune in the war. Sometimes, if possible, commanders would write a personal, unofficial letter to the relatives of the deceased. In it, they described the circumstances of the death, what their comrade was like, and tried to find words of comfort. Such letters were worth their weight in gold, as they contained a piece of living human warmth. There was another equally terrible document, a notification that a soldier was missing in action. This wording left the family in a painful state of uncertainty that could last for years. Hope fought with despair, preventing them from mourning or moving on with their lives. The funeral notice was the last letter from the war, a letter that no one wanted to receive. It became as terrible a symbol of war as destroyed cities and mass graves. It was a piece of paper that pierced the heart. What do you think was worse for the family? Receiving a funeral notice or a notice of missing in action? I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of frontline letters. The most recognizable symbol of frontline correspondence in the Red Army was the triangle letter. In conditions of total shortage of paper and, more importantly, envelopes, soldiers found a simple and ingenious solution. The letter was written on a regular sheet of paper, which was then folded in a special way. First, the sheet was folded from right to left, then from left to right. The remaining strip of paper at the bottom was tucked inside like a flap, forming a neat triangle. This shape had many advantages. First, it did not require an envelope, which was a rarity at the front. Second, such a triangle could not accidentally open during transport. The recipient's address and the sender's field post number were written on the outside of the triangle. There was no need for a stamp. Frontline letters were sent free of charge. This was important for soldiers who had no money. It was very easy for the censor to work with such letters. He could quickly unfold the triangle, read the text, stamp it, and fold it back up. This greatly speeded up the process of checking correspondence. The very sight of this paper triangle in the postman's hands made hearts beat faster. It was a message from the front, a sign that a loved one was alive. These triangles were carefully preserved in family archives as the most precious relics. The triangular shape became so canonical that even after the war, when envelopes were no longer in short supply, people sometimes folded letters this way out of habit. It became a symbol of the memory of the war. Interestingly, this practice did not exist in the German army. Wehrmacht soldiers used standard envelopes and postcards. The triangle is a purely Soviet invention, born of war and scarcity. Children in schools learned to fold such triangles in their labor classes when they wrote letters of support to unknown soldiers at the front. These touching children's messages with drawings and poems were a huge moral support for the soldiers. Today, the front triangle is a museum exhibit, but for millions of people, it will forever remain a symbol of hope, expectation, and faith in victory, a symbol of the unbreakable bond between the front and the rear. What the experts don't talk about. Every letter from and to the front passed through the hands of a military censor. It was an entire army of people armed with scissors and black ink who deleted any information from letters that was considered a military secret. The main task of censorship was to prevent the leakage of information about the deployment and numbers of military units, the names of commanders, the number of casualties, plans for future operations, and the availability of new weapons. Any mention of these topics was immediately cut out or painted over. Censors also deleted any expressions of panic or pessimism, complaints about poor supplies, criticism of the command, or expressions of doubt about victory were all considered to undermine morale and were not to reach the addressee, whether in the rear or at the front. The work of a censor was monotonous and psychologically difficult. Every day, hundreds of other people's letters, full of love, hatred, pain, and hope, passed through their hands. They became unwitting witnesses to thousands of human dramas. Sometimes, contrary to instructions, censors showed humanity. They might let a touching love confession slip through or not cut out an overly frank description of homesickness, understanding how important it was to people. But any information of a military nature was strictly forbidden. For soldiers, censorship was a given. They knew the rules of the game and tried not to break them. Letters often contain phrases such as, "I'll tell you the rest when we meet," or "I can't write about this," a signal that the author had exercised self-censorship. After being checked, the letter was stamped "Reviewed by Military Censorship." The presence of this stamp meant that the letter had been checked and could be sent on. Letters without this stamp aroused suspicion. Censorship was an integral part of total war. The state sought to control not only the actions, but also the thoughts and feelings of its citizens. Letters were one of the most important channels of information, and it was impossible to leave them uncontrolled. The archives contain clippings made by censors. These are fragments of phrases, individual words, and entire paragraphs that provide a unique insight into what soldiers really thought and felt, and what the state tried to hide from them. Despite all the efforts of censorship, letters remain the most honest document of the era. Even in the sanitized and edited texts, one could read between the lines the true feelings of people, their pain, and their unyielding will to live. What goes on in the soul of a person who knows they are going into their last battle? Sensing mortal danger before a major offensive, or finding themselves in a hopeless situation, many soldiers sat down to write their last letters. These were not just messages home, they were confessions, wills, and farewells. There was no room for everyday trifles or jokes in these letters. Soldiers wrote about the most important things: their love for their families, their regrets, their belief in the righteousness of their cause. They tried to fit their entire lives and all their tenderness into a few lines. Often, such letters were carried in a breast pocket next to documents. A note was made on the envelope: "In case of my death, delivered to the address." Finding such a letter from a fallen comrade and sending it to his family was a sacred duty for those who survived. These messages are imbued with tragic sincerity. In them, soldiers gave their last instructions to their children, asked for forgiveness from their wives and mothers, and dreamed of a future that they would never have. Every word in such a letter is carefully weighed and has enormous value. Commanders and political officers sometimes advised soldiers to write such letters before particularly dangerous operations. It was a cruel necessity, but it gave the soldier the opportunity to say goodbye in his mind and go into battle, fulfilling his last duty to his family. Reading such letters years later is a difficult experience. They are the direct voice of a person on the threshold of death. There is not a hint of falsehood or pathos in them, only the naked human soul. Sometimes such letters were found decades later, during search operations at battle sites. An unread message, lying in the ground for half a century, finally reached its addressee, bringing both the pain of loss and the joy of the last news. These letters have become monuments. They show that even in the face of imminent death, people thought not of themselves, but of those they loved. This is the highest manifestation of the strength of the human spirit. The last letters are the most poignant document of the war. They remind us of the terrible price millions of people paid for a peaceful life, and that love is truly stronger than death. What if everything you were taught about captivity is not entirely true? For a prisoner of war, a letter was the only way to let his family know that he was alive. For a person deprived of freedom and on the brink of survival, contact with home was like a breath of fresh air. Correspondence between prisoners of war was strictly regulated by international conventions, but in practice, everything depended on the camp authorities. Prisoners were allowed to send and receive a limited number of letters, usually one postcard per month. These messages were subject to double or even triple censorship. Letters could only be written on special standard forms. The text had to be short, written in block letters, and contain only personal, everyday information. Any information about the conditions of detention, the camp, or military events was strictly prohibited. Despite these restrictions, people managed to convey hidden information. A barely noticeable sign, a code phrase, or a mention of a mutual acquaintance could hint at the true state of affairs. But any careless hint could cost the sender solitary confinement or their life. Receiving a letter from home was a real event for a prisoner, giving him the strength to go on living. A photograph of a child, a few warm words from his wife, all this reminded him that he was loved and needed. For this, it was worth enduring hunger, cold, and humiliation. Letters were delivered to and from the camps through the International Red Cross. This organization did a tremendous job of locating prisoners and establishing contact with their families. But mail took months and sometimes years to arrive. For a family, receiving news from a soldier who was considered missing in action was tantamount to a miracle. The short phrase, "alive and well," on a standard form brought enormous relief and gave hope for a reunion. Many letters never reached their recipients. They were lost in the chaos of war, ended up in archives, or were destroyed by camp administrators. Behind every undelivered letter lies the tragedy of uncertainty. Letters from captivity are evidence of incredible fortitude. Living in inhuman conditions, people did not lose hope and clung to the thin thread that connected them to home. This correspondence was their quiet struggle for the right to remain human. We can see that letters during the war were much more than just a means of communication. They were psychological armor, a source of hope, a cure for despair, and an unbreakable thread connecting the front and the rear. In a world where human life had been devalued, a few lines on paper restored a soldier's identity, his history, and his future. Technologies such as V-mail, the soldier's ingenuity that gave rise to triangle letters, and the selfless work of the field post office were all aimed at maintaining this vital connection. Even the all-seeing censorship could not destroy the essence of the letter, the transmission of human warmth across distance. The stories of these letters are stories of love that was stronger than war, and of hope that did not die even under the most terrible fire. They teach us to value simple human communication and to remember that even in the darkest times, a word of support can be a real weapon. Which of these lessons in survival do you think are still relevant today? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.